Hi guys and welcome to my channel. Today I want to discuss knitting tension. What is knitting tension? Knitting tension, also known as gauge, refers to the number of stitches and rows in a knitted fabric within a specific measurement. Typically expressed as stitches and rows per inch or per 10 centimeters, it measures how tightly or loosely a knitter knits compared to the standard gauge specified in a pattern. Tension is crucial in knitting because it determines the size and fit of the finished piece. If your tension is too tight, more stitches and rows per inch, your fabric will be smaller than intended. If it's too loose, fewer stitches and rows per inch, your fabric will be larger. Achieving the correct tension ensures that your finished project matches the measurement given in the pattern. To check your tension, you can knit a gauge swatch using the same yarn and needle specified in the pattern. Then measure the number of stitches and rows within a specified area and compare it to the gauge given in the pattern. Adjust your needle size if necessary to match the pattern's gauge. How to make a gauge swatch? Making a gauge swatch is a straightforward process that involves knitting a small sample of fabric to determine your tension or gauge. Here's a step-by-step guide on how to make a gauge swatch. Select the yarn and needle specified in your knitting pattern. If the pattern doesn't specify, choose a yarn and needle size that you think will work with your project. Using the yarn and needles, cast on a sufficient number of stitches to create a square or rectangular swatch. Typically, you'll want to cast on more stitches than the width of your desired swatch to ensure an accurate measurement. Work in the stitch pattern specified in the pattern, if any, or simply knit every row garter stitch. For a basic swatch, knit until your swatch measures a few inches tall. This will ensure you have enough fabric to accurately measure your gauge. Once your swatch is the desired height, bind off all stitches to secure your work. Blocking is the process of wetting or steaming your knitted fabric to even out the stitches and dimensions. While optional for gauge swatches, blocking can give you a more accurate representation of your finished fabric. Follow the blocking instructions for your yarn type. Lay your swatch flat on a surface and use a ruler or gauge tool to measure the number of stitches and rows within a specified area. Typically, you'll measure over a 4-inch, 10 cm square. Count the stitches and rows horizontally and vertically. Then calculate the average number of stitches and rows per inch or per 10 cm. Compare your stitch and row count to the gauge specified in your knitting pattern. If your gauge matches the pattern gauge, you're all set to begin knitting your project. If not, you may need to adjust your needle size and knit another swatch until you achieve the correct gauge. If your gauge is too tight, more stitches or rows per inch, try using larger needles. If your gauge is too loose, fewer stitches or rows per inch, try using smaller needles. Repeat the process of knitting a swatch and measuring until you achieve the correct gauge. By following these steps, you can create a gauge swatch to ensure the proper sizing and fit of your knitted project. To calculate the gauge of your swatch, you need to determine the number of stitches and rows per inch, or per 4 inches depending on the pattern. Here's how you do the calculations. Lay your swatch flat on a surface and count the number of stitches horizontally across and vertically up and down within a specified measurement area. For most patterns, this area is a 4-inch square. Divide the number of stitches counted horizontally by the width of the measurement area, 4 inches. This gives you the number of stitches per inch. For example, if you counted 20 stitches across a 4-inch area, it will give you 5 stitches per inch. Similarly, divide the number of rows counted vertically by the height of the measurement area. This gives you the number of rows per inch. For example, if you counted 24 rows over a 4-inch area, it will give you 6 rows per inch. Record your gauge, write down the number of stitches per inch and rows per inch. In the example above, the gauge would be 5 stitches and 6 rows per inch. By calculating the gauge of your swatch, you can ensure that your knitting matches the intended measurements of the pattern. If your gauge doesn't match the pattern gauge, you may need to adjust your needle size or knit another swatch until you achieve the correct tension. Determining whether you knit loosely or tightly involves observing the characteristics of your knitted fabric and comparing them to the expected results. Here are some indicators to help you identify whether you knit loose or tight. Fabric density. Look at the density of your knitted fabric. If it feels dense and stiff, you might be knitting tightly. If it feels airy and loose, you might be knitting too loosely. Ease of stretch. Pull your fabric gently in different directions. If it stretches easily and significantly, you might be knitting too loose. If it's resistant to stretching and it feels firm, you might be knitting too tightly. Measure the dimensions of your knitted projects. If they constantly turn out smaller than the intended size in the pattern, you might be knitting too tightly. If they turn out larger, you might be knitting too loosely. Pay attention to how much yarn you use. If you constantly use more yarn than expected, you might be knitting too loosely and creating larger stitches that require more yarn. If you use less yarn than the pattern, you might be knitting too tightly, creating smaller stitches that use less yarn. Stitch appearance. Examine the appearance of your stitches. If they look tight, compressed, and lack definition, you might be knitting too tightly. If they look loose, uneven, and sloppy, you might be knitting too loosely. Your comfort level. Consider how comfortable it feels to knit. If you find it difficult to insert your needles into stitches and your hands feel strained, you might be knitting too tightly. If you find it difficult to control your tension and stitches slip off easily, you might be knitting too loosely. How to improve your knitting tension. Practice knitting with different needle sizes until you find the ones that allow you to achieve the desired tension. For me, for example, I have loose tension, so I know I must use smaller needles than the pattern recommends to achieve the desired tension. Pay attention to your hand and finger tension while knitting. Relaxing your grip can help achieve a more consistent tension. Knit gauge swatches before starting a project to ensure your tension matches the pattern's requirements. Experiment with different knitting styles and techniques to find what works best for you. Practice regularly to develop muscle memory and improve your knitting tension over time. If you have any more questions or inquiries, please leave me a comment or send me an email as provided at the end of this video. Thanks so much for watching. For more content, please like and subscribe for more.